Well, hi everyone. Welcome to our discussion about the U.S. debt clock. This is first of a couple, maybe three videos we'll make concerning information in the last part of our course. We'll start with the U.S. debt clock today and a couple more topics in the next two videos. I'll get these posted up probably once every couple of days through to the end of the semester. My hope is that we can look at some of these current events, things that are happening right now, and give you quite a bit of insight into the business environment, which will be very important to you as you become business professionals. So the U.S. Debt Clock website displays national income and taxing, spending, and other information that gives you some perspective concerning the United States production, labor, the national debt, the annual federal budget. This is the federal budget expenditures, sources and uses of funds for government, etc. There's a lot on it. It'll help illustrate some of the numerical comparisons that might be of particular interest to you, to business students in general, and it's a way to give you some perspective on the sometimes astronomical dollar amounts. So let me share my screen here. So this is located at usdebtclock.org. The 2024 version of the US Debt Clock contains quite a bit more information than in the past. You can actually use this time machine indicator right here to look and see what these numbers were in the past as well. But the modern US Debt Clock includes a lot more information than in the past, so you might not be able to directly compare some of these numbers. We will maybe look at that in another video. The most prominent number in this is in the upper left, the U.S. national debt, just above $36 trillion. Now, this is sourced from the U.S. Treasury, so these are not partisan numbers. This is nothing that one party or the other would put together. These numbers come from various sources that are nonpartisan in nature. So this national debt, if you look next to the national debt, is divided by the number of U.S. citizens to get the national debt per citizen. And right now that's at 106,642. That's for every man, woman, and child, working, non-working, babies, everybody. If you're a citizen, this is your share of the national debt that the politicians have borrowed on your behalf and has to be paid back. So I know you're happy about that. It becomes even scarier when you look next to that and it says debt per taxpayer, which is $272,821. Taxpayers are obviously not as large as the total population, total citizenship of the United States. So that's why this is a larger number. So if you're a taxpayer, you're part of this group, and your total is $272,821. So what causes the debt? Now, it's the same things that cause government debt would cause yours and mine to increase. Spending more than you make. For government, what they make is what they take from you and me in taxes out of what we make. In other words, you and I make money, and part of that is our personal budgets, and part of that is the federal government budget. So what do they spend our money on? Well, the upper left category also includes an item called U.S. federal spending, official. You see that right below the U.S. national debt. So this past year, the U.S. federal spending was a little over $7 trillion. Now, the official U.S. federal spending is different than actual U.S. federal spending. The actual U.S. federal spending is the total of the on-budget spending, which is about $7.1 trillion, plus off-budget items. Now, off-budget items would include expenditures unapproved by Congress, but spent anyway to appease economic, quote, needs, unquote. This is largely a matter of opinion or political desire, or political agendas, such as emergency spending approved by executive order, an activity that's more and more common even when no definable emergency is present. I thought this was interesting to look at, so I brought up a website that summarized executive orders. So George Washington, the first president, issued 8 executive orders. John Adams issued 1 in his 4-year term. Thomas Jefferson issued 4 in his 8-year term. That might make sense because the country was new and maybe some things needed to be accomplished through executive order. Andrew Jackson issued 12. Andrew Jackson was president during the manifest destiny of the expansion westward of the United States, so probably some of those executive orders were associated with that. On up to the Civil War, here's Abraham Lincoln, a Republican who opposed confederation of states in favor of a union of states, and one of the big issues there was the issue of slavery. He issued 48 executive orders. Andrew Johnson, 79. Ulysses S. Grant, 217. And then slide up to Theodore Roosevelt, who didn't feel held back at all with executive orders. Woodrow Wilson, Calvin Coolidge. Franklin Delano Roosevelt set another record at almost 4,000 executive orders. This was during the Great Depression. All the way up to modern presidents. See Bill Clinton here, 364. George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, and Joe Biden. A lot of these were reversals of the previous administrations. For example, a lot of Barack Obama's reversed some of the policies of the Bush administration before, and Donald Trump reversed some of the policies of the Obama administration. Joe Biden reversed a bunch of Donald Trump's policies. So while these may seem like an unusually high number of executive orders, especially in peacetime, more and more they have been something to use for political agendas. The point being that those off-budget items include expenditures unapproved by Congress but spent anyway, and executive orders are a big part of that. Back to the national debt clause. So the difference between official spending and actual spending is including things like presidential executive orders, even when no definable emergency is present. Another off-budget item can result from the passage of regulations that cause extra expense not included in the approved budget, but that have to be paid as a result of the regulatory requirement. And other examples exist, and the total explains the difference in the official versus the actual spending. So how much money does the government make? Actually, we make the money and they take it from us. It's called tax revenues, and this appears in the upper right category on the debt clock. We have U.S. federal tax revenue, we have state revenue, local revenue, and you'll note there's a difference between U.S. federal tax revenue of 5.05 and U.S. federal spending, 7.257 trillion. And any time spending is greater than the amount of tax revenue taken in by government, we have what's called a budget deficit, which is explained by this 2.208 trillion, the difference between tax revenues collected, 5.05 trillion, and 7.257 trillion of total spending. Every year the U.S. runs a federal budget deficit, it becomes part of the U.S. national debt and compounds. So what would happen if the United States government spent less than the amount of federal tax revenue that they took in? Well, that would be called a surplus. The last year where tax revenues exceeded the spending was in 1998, where the label would have been surplus here. And you might be curious as to who the president was in 1998. I believe that was Bill Clinton. So these two sections of the U.S. debt clock offer a good opportunity to look at the staggering magnitude of the national debt as a compilation of the budget deficits and surpluses from the past, mainly deficits because we have such a huge debt now. Deficit spending has become the norm in the modern United States, and there's a good reason for that. It would be political suicide for a politician to balance the budget or to run a surplus. It would require reducing spending on programs on which many constituents have become dependent, or on spending programs that are considered entitlements. Entitlements include things like veterans benefits or Social Security benefits. And you might say, yes, those people are entitled to Social Security benefits. They paid into the system, but because they're entitlements, it's very unlikely they would be decreased. So how do you fund them? Well, you either do that by increasing taxes on income earners, or you borrow the difference, which increases the deficit, which contributes to the U.S. national debt. If a politician runs on that platform, anybody who's dependent on government, they say, I'm going to reduce your benefits. You probably won't like them. And the rest of the population that pays in terms of tax revenue, they tell you that they're going to increase your taxes. You probably wouldn't be very happy about that either. There are not many people left to vote. to support such an agenda. So it's unlikely that this is going to be solved by repayment of the debt. You would have to run budget surpluses for many years to repay this debt. We'll talk in a couple minutes about the likelihood of being able to service this debt, in other words, pay the interest expense. In fact, let's take a look at that now. Right under this section is largest budget items. And you see that the largest budget item by far is Medicare Medicaid at $1.833 trillion. Social Security is the next largest at $1.497 trillion. And interestingly enough, the interest on the national debt this year has now surpassed defense spending. The interest on the debt is $998 billion, and spending for defense is $946 billion. The reason the interest on the national debt has increased so much involves a long-term reason that government keeps on deficit spending, and it also involves a short-term reason because recently interest rates have gone up, and that increases the interest on the national debt as well. The reason interest on government securities increased was because we've had 3 years of quite a high rate of inflation. The rate of change in the interest on the U.S. debt is also of interest. Pardon the pun. Notice this is increasing very rapidly. 80,000, 90,000, 100,000, 110,000. So this is increasing very rapidly. That's because spending is occurring far in excess of U.S. federal tax revenue that is being brought in under current taxation laws. So the budget deficit continues to rise to new record highs as time passes. Also in this category that might be of particular interest to you or to your classmates is the magnitude of student loan debt. Currently around $1.74 trillion, that's down here, $1.74 trillion. To make some meaningful comparisons, this debt is a whopping 39% of U.S. federal tax revenue. In other words, of all the taxes collected this year, 39% of that is the same dollar figure as student loan debt. So the question I always get when discussing this is, how could the current U.S. president promise to repay something during his administration whose level comes very close to the largest U.S. budget item, Medicare Medicaid, at $1.8 trillion, student loan debt $1.7 trillion. And rather than deal with that directly, I usually refer to the old joke, how can you tell a politician is lying? And the answer is their lips are moving. So the numbers on the debt clock changing at a rapid rate are often mind-boggling, even to faculty I talk to. To bring it down to a relatable level, I ask my students to consider the trillions of dollars exhibited on the debt clock to be tens of thousands instead, and to imagine a modest household earning income, tax revenues, for government, of $50,484. So look over here at the U.S. federal tax revenue, $50,484. So we're calling these thousands instead of trillions. The household spends every dime of that income and then uses credit cards to spend $17,536 more than their $50,484 income, for total spending of $72,571. And for my students, this is usually a shocking realization of what the federal government is doing in the current year. I then ask them to imagine that this household has done this for many years, and that the household incurs an average 7% interest rate on their accumulated credit card debt of $360,186. That's almost 8 times their current income of $50,484. If that were the interest paid on their accumulated debt, the interest expense alone would be around $25,000. That's half their income. Of course, our government can borrow at an average of about 2.1% interest currently, so it's not as bad as a household would experience. But invariably, I'll have a student that points out that 7% would be a ridiculously low interest rate on a credit card. So the situation would actually be much worse than I described. Okay, so a discussion of the tax burden in the U.S. is usually a good discussion at this point. Personal taxes include federal and state income tax, sales tax, excise tax, estate tax, gift tax, etc. In some states, the total personal tax burden exceeds 50% of income. That particular rabbit trail requires a little research into data sources other than the debt clock, so we'll leave that for another time. However, in addition to personal taxes, corporate and business income and other tax is a good discussion. For any intermediate or large corporation, the federal income tax rate is currently around 21%, and state income tax rates vary by state from 0, like in Texas and Tennessee and Florida, to around 9% in states that do have a state income tax. The states that have low or no corporate income tax usually have a tax on gross receipts, which usually makes up for the 0 income tax rate. Although estimates of average business tax rates are varied, a middle-of-the-road conjecture would be around 26%. And what do the companies do? Well, the companies, of course, pass these costs on to you, the consumers of their products. For products that go through multiple layers of production, every wholesale level of business is taxed on their income and gross receipts, and the final consumer pays sales tax on the product on top of that. So the ultimate share of a product's price that went in to pay each company's taxes would be a very large chunk, perhaps 30% conservatively. Add 30% of spending and the up to 50% of direct individual taxes, it's not hard to imagine that a 70% or greater tax burden, depending on where you live, could result, and does in certain states. So maybe that gives you a little bit of perspective. I mean, the U.S. rebelled against a 2% tea tax back in the Revolutionary War days, so that begs the question, why aren't we more concerned about the really, really high tax rate we have now compared to the 2% tax on tea? So back to the debt clock. On the U.S. debt clock, U.S. gross domestic product is there, or GDP, is shown, which indicates arguably the market value of all final goods and services produced and sold within U.S. borders in a year. It's a staggering $29.32 trillion, and that appears right here in the second box, $29.32 trillion. Note that our federal debt exceeds that number. In other words, the amount the U.S. owes is more than a year of our gross domestic product, which gives you an idea of the magnitude of the debt again. There was a lot of concern expressed about this in early 2012 when the national debt surpassed total GDP for the first time. In 2012, it was 100% of GDP, in other words. And there are many well-informed individuals who have raised the alarm of the unsustainability of that trend, especially if interest rates continue to stay relatively high. That means the interest on the national debt would see rises in the average interest rate, and it would increase the interest expense budget item. There's a lot of disagreement among true economists, and a lot of disagreement among politically motivated economists as well, about whether there is a great need to be alarmed about it, however. One argument says that we should chastise the irresponsibility of politicians in continuing to deficit spend. They pass on the burden of the excesses of today to future generations. On the other hand, there's a political camp that embraces printing money and using debt freely, and they say there are a few negative consequences. You might have heard this in your economics courses. It's called modern monetary theory. But modern monetary theory has faced criticism for its departure from traditional economic principles. First of all, the focus on government's ability to print money without immediate consequences challenges kind of the core tenets of fiscal responsibility. There have been concerns raised about the potential for unchecked inflation. I'm sure you have personally experienced the consequences of this abuse of power in the past 3 years. Maybe that would convince people that modern monetary theory might not be all it's cracked up to be. Doubts about MMT also arise regarding the practicality and effectiveness of relying on taxation as a tool to manage inflation. So the theory's deviation from established economic theory has left many economies unconvinced, with reservations about its real-world application and its potential to create more problems than solutions. But to a politician who wants re-election, its appeal is obvious. unbridled spending with limitless money without consequence, that's something they can enthusiastically promote. Depends on what an individual believes, and I don't intend to tell you what to believe. My preference is to present the situation and let you come up with your own belief about it. And I hope you do. This course, if anything else, provides you a logical and knowledgeable basis for deciding how you feel about these things. So there's a lot here on the U.S. debt clock. You can look at many of the line items. It may be obvious that many lively discussions are initiated by exploring the U.S. debt clock line items. The possibilities, supplemented by other data and information sources, are pretty much endless. So after making some sense of these rapidly changing numbers, my hope is that you feel a sense of understanding and empowerment and potentially begin to think about what numbers and numerical comparisons actually mean. So perhaps you can use the knowledge of the U.S. debt clock to help others to understand what's going on. You have the context of an entire course on financial markets and institutions. So I really do hope you feel empowered at this point.